Again, today's webinar is being recorded, and over the next few days, we'll send you a follow-up email with the on-demand links to the presentation deck and the webinar recording. So keep an eye out for an email over the next couple of days. As I mentioned, today's webinar is called Hands-on Lab, Introducing Microsoft SQL Server in AWS. Our presenter today is Lou Delatorre. Today with us, we also have a great team of moderators who are excited to answer questions that you have, so please test their typing skills and make them have something to do. So submit any questions you have to our moderators, Phil, Tom, and Bill. Another quick reminder, today is a hands-on lab, and over the next couple of hours, over the next day, you should receive an email at the email that you registered with to allow you access to the lab. So today we will be cutting off the live Q&A. However, we will be opening the lab for a full 48 hours. So I'll provide an email address for you to reach out with any questions that you have at that time. Again, you'll have to wait for an email to complete the lab portion at home. And now, Lou, welcome. The floor is yours. You can go ahead and unmute your microphone and begin.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Introduction to Microsoft SQL Server in AWS webinar and hands-on lab. My name is Lou with AWS. I'm a solutions architect, and I've been here now for over 2.5 years. I help partners and customers alike with their Windows architectures and migrations to AWS. I've been in the industry now for over 2.5 decades, and I have experience with systems and cloud architecture, systems management, disaster recovery, process improvement, compliance management, all with the focus on Windows workloads, of course. Today, I'll be providing you a brief introduction into SQL Server on AWS, including Amazon RDS SQL Server and SQL on EC2. I'll also walk you through a demo of how to deploy, manage, and migrate SQL Server to AWS via a hands-on lab. And then, as Quentin mentioned, we'll provide you with access to the lab so that you can execute the steps on your own and get some real-world experience on how to use SQL Server on AWS. So let's go ahead and get started here. As you may know, AWS has 2 services where you can run Microsoft SQL Server. Amazon RDS, which stands for Relational Database Service, is a fully managed service that takes some administrative tasks off your shoulders, like backups and patching, for example, and allows you to focus on your business and your schema design and your indexes on your databases themselves. So we do the heavy lifting for you when it comes to actually managing the server side of SQL Server. On the other hand, Amazon EC2, which stands for Elastic Compute Cloud, lets you run your SQL Server where you have full control over the instance. In either case, you can bring your own license or buy your licenses from AWS, which is called License Included. For example, when you launch an Amazon EC2 instance, you can choose one of our AMIs with Windows Server and SQL Server. In that case, your hourly instance cost includes the software licenses for both. So let's compare running SQL Server on EC2 versus RDS for a moment. Now, the most significant thing to notice here is that both environments are already familiar because you can use SQL Server Management Studio to manage either SQL on EC2 or RDS. Either one of these solutions also supports SQL Server integration services, for example. In RDS's case, you would point to it as a data source. Now, the bottom 4 rows on this slide simply reflect the differences between having a managed service like RDS versus full control over the instance like you would on service. You get automated backups and really simple support for high availability. But that convenience does come with somewhat less control over the instance itself. Now let's talk about SQL on EC2 for a few moments here before we talk about RDS. Now, having multiple availability zones is really a game changer within AWS. Most organizations, and perhaps you've experienced this yourself in your own setups with SQL Server on premises, they find it that it's difficult to set up synchronous commit between data centers. And the issue is the latency when you're trying to commit or enable synchronous commit over multiple data centers across the link. But our inter-AZ latency within AWS is in the single digits when it comes to milliseconds. So single, often 1 to 2 milliseconds. So multi-AZ deployments with synchronous commit are very practical within AWS. So this means that you can do automatic failover. Now, just think about that for a moment. How or when could you have done this before? When you deploy offsite synchronous replication with AWS, you don't have to build your own infrastructure. You don't have to build your own wiring, your power, your rack and stack, for example. And synchronous replication between our AZs is very distinct from what's available from other vendors or even other data centers. So it's really something that is a great enabler for our customers in being able to set up high availability across multiple availability zones. Now this diagram here shows a multi-region, multi-AZ or availability zone design for SQL Server always on. Now this is not required, and most organizations won't use this type of architecture. Automatic failover occurs between AZs, but there's also asynchronous commit over VPN regions or between regions via VPN. So that allows you to do a manual failover at that level. Now this does require a VPN link between the two AWS regions, but this is just an example for you in case you wanted to deploy some type of multi-region always-on availability group. The second region shown there can actually also be your own data center, for example. And you can actually use this additional replica for backups or for reporting or for other purposes to offload some of those activities from your primary database server. Now, an architecture across two availability zones is mostly for high availability. But if you're concerned about the risk of an entire region becoming unavailable, then there's two options you have for DR. The first option reduces your recovery time objective and your recovery point objective, but running a hot standby would obviously cost more money. A lower cost option is what we call just-in-time DR. This means you stand by with your CloudFormation templates, which is basically infrastructure as code, ready to automatically spin up your infrastructure in another AZ or region. And then you restore your SQL backups from S3. Now this will take a little bit longer, and it really depends on your environment, the size of your database, what that environment looks like. It can take anywhere from minutes to even a whole day. And it may risk losing a small amount of data depending on how much you manage, how you manage your SQL transaction logs, but it's certainly another option for you to think about if you have a requirement of to DR across another region, for example. Now, here's some good news. If your secondary instance is truly passive, and if you have Microsoft Software Assurance and BYOL, you can cut your SQL license cost in half. License mobility is a benefit of Microsoft Software Assurance. But keep in mind that your passive instance should not be used as a read replica. It truly has to be passive. There are many benefits to buying license included SQL Server from AWS, but this is not one of them. The passive license benefit only applies to BYOL, so keep that in mind. Now let's focus on RDS for a few minutes. Again, that's our relational database service, our managed database offering. Now, RDS is currently limited to 30 databases per instance. You can use Windows or mixed authentication, and it also supports transparent data encryption, SSL for encryption in transit. And another interesting feature is native backup and restore to and from Amazon S3. To bring your own license to RDS, you can submit a license mobility form to Microsoft to verify your licenses, and then Microsoft will email you and AWS. You can deploy your application up to 10 days before submitting the form. When you launch your RDS instance, just choose BYOL instead of license included in the dropdown. So that covers the overview of SQL Server itself on AWS. Of course, there's much more that we can talk about. We can spend hours talking about SQL on AWS, but really what we want to get to is to get to the lab. The best way to learn is really to get hands-on experience with both SQL on EC2 and Amazon RDS, just so you can see how familiar it truly is, just as if you were running it on your own data center, because you're really using the same tools that you would use on-prem, you would also use in AWS. So we feel that you'll get the most benefit by going through the lab itself. So this slide that we have here is really just a preview of the demo and what you'll do in the lab. And there are 4 key aspects to the lab to keep in mind. First, when you click Start Lab, the lab environment runs CloudFormation to automatically create an EC2 instance and an RDS instance for you. The EC2 instance will be used as a workstation to mimic an on-premises instance or server of SQL Server. And the name QL created RDS, which you'll see in the console, just means that QuickLab creates that instance with CloudFormation. So just keep that in mind. Now the next thing is that at the beginning of the lab, you will launch your own RDS instance called RDS Test. But it takes about 15 to 20 minutes for an RDS instance to spin up, which if you think about everything that's involved there, that's pretty remarkable. But to avoid waiting on that instance for about 15 to 20 minutes, you'll be doing the rest of the lab with the QL created instance. So in other words, after you launch RDS Test, you'll just ignore it. That's just to demonstrate how easily you can deploy an RDS instance on AWS. And then after that's completed, you'll leverage the RDS instance that's created via the lab itself so that you can perform the rest of the steps without having to wait. Third, you're going to use PowerShell to download the AdventureWorks database for Microsoft. And then we're going to create it in the SQL workstation or the SQL on EC2 instance. Then fourth, you will export that AdventureWorks from your EC2 instance into your RDS instance. And really the purpose of that is to demonstrate how easily you can migrate a database to the cloud. Now the table here is just comparing 2 databases that you'll be working with. To connect to the AdventureWorks database on the EC2 instance, you can use a local administrator account with Windows authentication. Now RDS also supports Windows authentication, but we're not setting up Active Directory in this lab, which is a requirement for Windows authentication, of course. So instead, you'll be using SQL authentication for RDS itself. Now, finally, notice that the destination database is called sample. So that's where you're going to be migrating the AdventureWorks database to within the RDS instance. Okay, so those are the main points I wanted to touch on before I get into the demo. And you won't have to do anything for the demo itself, but watch, and I'll show you a few things that will help you with the lab. And then as soon as the demo is over, you'll get further instructions on when you'll be receiving instructions and how you'll be receiving instructions on how to actually conduct the lab yourself. So let's go ahead and get started here with the demo. So I have my quicklabs.com account here. I'm logged into QuickLabs. I've already searched for the catalog. What you'll want to do when you launch QuickLabs and log in is select the lab catalog link. And it'll show you, the first tab will show you quests, which are pretty cool. You might want to check these out later on, but there's different quests that you can go on that include any number of different labs to help accomplish the quest. There's design with AWS Lambda and many other Windows-related quests in this QuickLabs as well. But we're going to focus primarily for this webinar and lab on a specific lab. So you'll want to click on Labs itself. And near the very beginning, the fourth lab down is the Introduction to Amazon Relational Database Service SQL Server lab. That's the one we're going to want to select. But if for some reason it's not shown there as a fourth option, you can always just search for RDS and hit enter, and it'll pull it right up to the top of the list. So again, it's the Introduction to Amazon Relational Database Service SQL Server lab. So I'll go ahead and select that. And this will bring up our lab guide, as well as the instructions to go through the lab, which are also going to be provided to you separately as a download. And those instructions will be provided again a little later before or once this demo is completed. So to launch the lab, the first thing you're going to want to do right away is just start lab. And you'll be able to launch your lab either with the code that's provided or with the credit, but again, those instructions will be sent to you. And the lab itself will then begin to launch, and you'll see that you have about 50 minutes to complete the lab once you start it. So I believe you were told that you have about 48 hours to launch and complete the lab, which is true, but once you launch it, you have about 50 minutes to actually go through it and complete it. So be sure to have the time that you need to get through the lab once you start that lab. So go ahead and scroll down. You'll see there's a lab overview and instructions, kind of a brief overview again of what Amazon RDS is. We've already discussed that. But some key things to note regarding the lab itself here in the instruction guide are the properties. So again, the setup is the estimated time to set up the lab. Environment's already been, it's currently in process of being set up. The access is the time the lab will run before automatically shutting down. So we have less than 50 minutes. It shouldn't take you no more than 30 minutes or so. And then the estimated time the lab should take to complete. So let's go ahead and start with our lab. So I've already clicked on start. We see the status bar there, shows the progress of the lab environment. And as I mentioned before, we're not going to wait for the RDS instance to be created. We're going to, or the one that we're going to create, we're going to leverage the one that's created by this lab. So in the lab resources, the first thing we're going to do is click on Open Console. And this will log us into our AWS console. And within the AWS Management Console, on the Services menu, now I've already have it highlighted here, RDS, because I've used it recently or visited that service recently. But in case it's not in your recently visited services, click on the Services drop-down list. And here you're going to see a list of all the different services that we offer at AWS. And there's over 90 different services now, so many to choose from. We've got these broken up into different categories for compute, storage, database, which is what we're going to focus on. So within database, notice that there's an RDS option. So let's go ahead and click on RDS. And then this brings us to the RDS dashboard. Now the first thing we're going to do within the dashboard is launch a database instance. So again, this is just to demonstrate how easily you can launch a SQL Server database instance within AWS. Now notice that you have the option of selecting from 6 different database engines that are supported within AWS. Now this is a Microsoft SQL Server lab, and that's our focus as part of this webinar, so we'll go ahead and select SQL Server. Within SQL Server, you have options for different types of SQL Server, from SQL Server Express all the way down to SQL Server Enterprise Edition. Now for this lab, we have access to the SQL Server Standard Edition, so we'll go ahead and select that. And then we're brought to the, what's the purpose of this database? Is it for production or is it for dev test? And really what this option does is just, if it's for production, the recommendation there is use a multi-AZ deployment, which I discussed previously in the slides, which is for high availability. But if it's for dev test, then you can simply deploy a single SQL Server instance, which is intended for use outside of production. So that's what we'll click on next step. On the specified database details screen, we're going to leave all the default values except just a few. So the very first one is license model. So as I mentioned before, you have the option of bringing your own license or selecting license included, which includes the hourly cost of running this database SQL Server on AWS, and that's the one we're going to select for this lab. Under database instance class, we're going to select dbm4.large, so that basically represents the resources that are allocated to that instance type. So this one, for example, has 2 vCPU with 8 gig of RAM. You see the options for some of the other RDS instances. And then we'll accept the rest of the defaults and go down to the settings. Within settings, we're going to specify a DB instance identifier. So we'll call this RDS test. Under username, we'll call the username student. Again, we're using the SQL Server authentication versus Windows authentication in this example. So go with student, and then we'll give it a password, which again, you'll have all these instructions at your fingertips as soon as you begin the lab. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and click Next Step. And this brings us to the Configure Advanced Settings screen. Again, we're going to leave all the default values except a few options here. The first one is the publicly accessible option. It's currently set to yes. We'll just change that to no. Under VPC, see that we're going to select the RDS QLS security group. And this is a security group that was created as part of this lab using CloudFormation. So for the lab, we'll go ahead and select that, which is going to give us the appropriate security groups and firewall settings for us to be able to migrate our database from the EC2 instance to the RDS instance. And then finally, down below under backup retention period, we're just going to change that to 0 since we don't need any backup retention for this lab and for this test. But if you needed backups for a test dev or production server, the default setting there is 7. That can certainly be modified. Okay, with those options, then we'll go ahead and launch the DB instance. So our DB instance is being created. We can go ahead and click on View our DB instances, and this brings us to the DB instances screen. And you notice our RDS test DB instance is being created. So with that, let's go back to the services menu. And we're going to go now to networking and content delivery and select VPC, which is our virtual private cloud. And within our VPC, there are what are called security groups. We're going to select our security groups. So we're going to edit the security group that's been applied to the RDS instance that we created so that we can enable access to the database from other machines. So if it's not showing, it's because the lab is still in the process of creating this via the CloudFormation template. So we'll just give it a few seconds, and there we go. So there's our security groups. We'll scroll on, we'll drag it down. So again, if you don't see it, it just may take a few seconds, and then you'll see the security groups become available as the lab is being created via the CloudFormation template. So let's go ahead and select the RDS QLS security group, which is this third one here. And at the bottom of the screen, we're going to select Inbound Rules tab. The Inbound Rules tab, we're going to go ahead and edit, click on Edit, and we're going to modify this rule. So the rule for Microsoft SQL Server, port 1433, is currently configured to allow inbound traffic only from instances of the group. So we're going to, for the purposes of this lab, just going to edit the source column and change that to allow any instance to be able to connect to it, regardless of which security group they're members of. So what we'll do here is just type in 0.0.0/0. So this basically means that any source can access this SQL Server database instance. Now, this is on any source from within this VPC because, remember, we did not make it publicly accessible. So it's privately accessible at this point from within this VPC. Best practice would be if you were setting this up in production to specify the application servers that will be connecting to this backend database as the source. And that way you're limiting who can access this database server to only those resources that require access to it. But for this lab, we'll go ahead and leave it open. So we'll click on Save, and that updates our security setting appropriately. Okay, so while we were creating the database RDS test, an instance of Windows Server was being prepared for our use as a workstation or as a sample SQL Server that may be running on premises, for example. So let's go ahead and take a look at that EC2 instance. So again, we're going to click on the drop-down, Services drop-down, and select EC2 under Compute. And then in the navigation pane here on the left, we're going to select Instances. So we see our instances at the very top there. We'll drag this down a little bit just so we can have a better view of our instance. Now, this is the EC2 instance, as I mentioned, that was created for us to simulate our on-premises SQL Server. So we'll go ahead and copy the public DNS string to our clipboard. So right here on the top right-hand side, you can go ahead and copy this public DNS string so that we can connect to the instance itself. So if you're running Windows, it includes Remote Desktop Connection client, the RDP client. So you can connect using that to the instance. But if you're running a Mac or a Linux workstation, then you may need to download a remote desktop protocol client application for it. And in the instructions, there are links to both Mac and Linux if you need that. So you'll have access to that there if you need to download that. I have a Windows, so I'll go ahead and use remote desktop connection. And I'll paste my public DNS string and want to select show options. Under username, I'll go ahead and type administrator. And then I'll go ahead and click on connect. So it's attempting to connect to that EC2 instance, and it's asking for the password. So I'm going to switch back to the Quick Labs guide, and you'll notice that there's a password here for the RDP session. So I'll go ahead and copy this password, which you'll have access to as well once you start the lab, and click on administrator, and we'll Control V and paste that password in there and click OK. I'm going to go ahead and check don't ask me again for connections to this computer and click yes. And this brings me to my desktop. Now, since the instance is just launching, because it was just created, it may take a few minutes for the remote desktop to appear. So we'll just give it a minute or so, and then we'll continue on. So again, this server is simulating our on-premises SQL Server. It already has SQL Server installed on it. So what we're going to do is log into this Windows instance with SQL. We're going to launch Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. And then we're going to use to AdventureWorks database into this SQL Server. And after we do that, then we'll go ahead and go through the process of migrating that database server over to the RDS instance on AWS. Still doing its thing here. Okay, so the instance is almost done being created. So as you're going through the lab, if you get to the step and it's taking a little bit, just keep in mind that this is all being created, so it may take a few minutes. Just have to be a little bit patient and allow it to go through its process. While this is going on, let me see if there are any questions. that I can answer while that's launching here. So one question that was asked by Beth, it's a really good question, is can I run availability groups on AWS? And the answer to that question is yes, you can run availability groups on Amazon EC2. Remember, there's Amazon EC2 and RDS, which is our managed database service offering. And you can run availability groups on Amazon EC2. Multi-AZ failover is a managed option on RDS, but availability groups specifically are not implemented on RDS at this time. But you certainly can use availability groups with SQL Server on EC2. So let's go back, and we'll get back to some of those other questions a little bit later. But let's go back to our desktop here now that it's finished launching. And let's go ahead and look for Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. So I'll go ahead and launch the SQL Server Management Studio now back on our SQL on EC2 instance. And while that is launching, we're going to go ahead and install a sample database on the EC2 instance so that we can learn how to migrate it to Amazon RDS instance. So let's go ahead and click on our Start button in the Windows menu, and let's look for Windows PowerShell ISC, and we'll go ahead and launch our Windows PowerShell ISC. And while that's launching, we're going to want to copy and paste 4 lines into the PowerShell script pane that will actually download our AdventureWorks database. So let me go ahead, go back to the guide. Okay. Lost my Quick Labs guide there. So let me just pull that up again really quick. Pull down, and we're going to find here, so I have it copied, bring up my remote desktop, paste that into the PowerShell script pane, and then we're going to go ahead and run the script. And as you can see there, it downloads a sample database called AdventureWorks. So let's go ahead and find that database by opening up Windows Explorer. And we're going to go to users, excuse me, users, and public, and db dump. And we're going to extract this file. We'll just select extract all and extract. That gives us our database and log file. So now let's go ahead and get back into our SQL Management Studio, see if that's open. Looks like it's loading our SQL Management Studio. So once that's launched, then we'll go ahead and connect to our local instance of SQL Server on this server using Windows authentication. And we'll see that the AdventureWorks database has been created. And then we'll also connect to our RDS instance. So before we do that, we actually do have to import the database into our local instance. So let me do that first. And then there's a PowerShell script again that I need to copy. So this command here is going to import the database into our SQL Server. So we'll go back to our PowerShell scripting pane, remove the previous script PowerShell commands that we ran, and we'll paste the SQL command to actually import this database into our local SQL Server. Go ahead and click on Execute. And down below, you'll see we're executing the command here to import our database. And we see that the database has been imported into the local SQL Server. So let's go back to our SQL Management Studio. Okay, there we are. So we're now at our SQL Management Studio console. We're going to go ahead and click on Connect to connect to our local database server. And go ahead and expand databases. And notice that our AdventureWorks database has been successfully imported into this instance of SQL on EC2. So now we need to gather connection details or information to create a connection to our remote RDS instance. So to do that, we've got to go back to our console. Okay, let me open the console again. There we go. So within our console, we'll click on Services. And in our history pane, we see here that it's now located within history, so we don't have to search for it. We can just click on RDS, which brings us to the RDS dashboard. We'll select instances, and we'll see that both of the instance that was created by CloudFormation via the Quick Lab is this QL created RDS. So we're going to check the box beside the QL created RDS. And what we want to do is copy this endpoint, because that's the connection string we're going to use to connect to our RDS instance via our SQL Server EC2 instance. So with that copied, let's go back to our RDP session. And let's bring up Notepad. And let's paste our connection string. I'm going to go ahead and remove 1433:1433. That will not be required when connecting using SQL Server Management Studio. So with the endpoint string selected, copied, let's go ahead go back into our SQL Server Management Studio. In the connect, we're going to select the drop-down box, and we're going to select to a database engine. And under server name, we're going to paste our RDS instance connection string. Now, since we're using SQL Server Authentication, we'll go ahead and change that to SQL Server Authentication. We'll type in our student name and our password. And click on Connect. So that's attempting to connect to our RDS instance. Wait a few seconds here. So it gave us a failure. connected. So looks like we are connected to our QL created RDS instance. Now let's just make sure we're connected and see if we can create our database. So I'm going to right click on databases and select new database. It's taking a little bit longer than usual, but there it is. Okay, so we got our new database screen. Type in sample, and we'll go ahead and click OK. And it created our sample database. Okay, so we're connected to our RDS instance from our local SQL Server on EC2 instance. So this is a remote connection to the RDS instance, and as you noticed, we just created a database called sample database on that remote database RDS instance. So this basically shows you how you can use SQL Server Management Studio from a remote workstation or SQL Server to log into your RDS instance and create your own database. So now let's export the AdventureWorks database from the SQL Server on EC2 to the Amazon RDS instance. So within the Object Explorer, beneath the local database, that's shown here, the win-k database server, we're going to go ahead and right-click on the AdventureWorks database, and we'll go to Tasks and select Export Data. On the Welcome to SQL Server Import and Export wizard, we're going to go ahead and click Next. In the Data Source drop-down list, we're going to, once this becomes available, we'll go ahead and select the SQL Server, but it may take a minute or so to initialize, so we'll give that a few seconds. Once it becomes available, we'll go ahead and select it and scroll all the way down, and you'll see SQL Server Native Client 11.0. In the server name drop-down list, if this local server name is not selected, in our case it is, but if it wasn't, you would just type localhost as your source database server. In the authentication section, we want to verify that Use Windows Authentication is selected for this SQL Server on EC2 instance. And in the database section, we just want to confirm that AdventureWorks is selected, and then click Next. In the destination drop-down list, again, we want to click on the drop-down, and we want to scroll all the way to the bottom and select SQL Server Native Client 11.0. For the server name, we want to paste that RDS instance connection string that we copied from the AWS Management Console. We want to paste that into server name. And then for authentication, again, we want to select SQL Server Authentication for RDS, type student as a username, and the password. In the database section, we want to select a drop-down and select the sample database that we created on this RDS instance. So that's sample. And then we'll click on Next. On the specify table, copy, or query page, we'll verify that copy data from one or more table or views is selected. So that's the very top one. Click on next. Then we're going to see a list of all the tables for the AdventureWorks database. We'll go ahead and select the very first box, which is going to select all the tables for us. Then we'll go ahead and click on next. On the Save and Run package page, we're just going to want to make sure that Run Immediately is selected. And then we'll go ahead and click on Finish twice and allow this to execute. So we see the copy operation starts, and within a few minutes or a few seconds to a minute, it moves all the tables and all the data to the database in our Amazon RDS instance. And a message is displayed there at the top indicating that the operation was successful. So we can see all the different tables here, all the different tasks that were completed. The status is set to success. So go ahead and click on close. And now what we'll do to verify that the data transferred successfully is we'll go back to our SQL Server Management Studio and Object Explorer. We'll expand the databases object under the QL created RDS instance, and we'll right-click on the sample database, which is here, and we'll right-click on that and select New Query. And in the query window, we're going to type a command just to ensure that the data has been copied over. And this command is in our lab guide. You can copy it or you can type it in. I'll go ahead and type it in here. So we're just ensuring that we have data in our database. So as you can see, we do have data there. We have a list of records that are displayed below in the results tab. And as you can see there, we have addresses, address line, city, state. So the AdventureWorks database was successfully migrated from the simulated on-premises SQL Server environment to the RDS instance database in AWS. So just an example of how you can load a database and execute queries against the RDS SQL Server instance. So that pretty much concludes our lab. To close it out, once you are finished with the lab itself, you can go back to your console, your EC2 console. Select your name on the drop-down list and just sign out. That'll sign you out of the AWS Management Console. And then you can go back into your Quick Lab and just select End Lab. And you'll be asked for a quick survey, and that will complete the lab itself.